And thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about some wholesale market readiness for produce, vegetable farms, fruit farms, like. My name is Michelle Proscia. I'm one of the ag educators over at Cornell Cooperative Extension in Sullivan County. And we have the pleasure here of having Elizabeth Higgins with us. I'll let Liz tell her title.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I'm a extension specialist in ag business management and production economics for, I work specifically with produce farms, fruit and vegetable in mostly Eastern New York.
Mhm. Yes, so thanks for joining us today. And we're going to go ahead and go through this PowerPoint. And again, if you have any questions, shoot them in the chat box or, unmute. We want to make it hopefully a little more interactive since there is a little bit of information today. Let's see. All right, so moving right into basically what is wholesale, and kind of your wholesale channels give you the ability to move large amounts of product generally quickly and normally at a lower price than through direct channels. So, but not always at a lower price. That's not like a standard thing, but I just want to mention that that's kind of how wholesale channels work. When we talk about wholesale marketing channels, they include selling directly to restaurants, retailers, distributors, produce auctions, processors, you name it. So as long as you can sell your product directly to somebody through one of these channels, that could be considered wholesale. Why would you want to sell this way? Well, there's a couple different things to consider. The sales volume price. So generally you're able to sell a larger volume of product at sometimes less of a price, but you're able to get that kind of distinct sale pretty regularly. So you're able to move a lot of product, a little bit of time, rather than doing other marketing channels such as like farmers markets, that sort of thing, where there is a little bit more time involved. It might be the way that you want to run your business. So lifestyle preferences, folks sometimes don't want to do all that time with selling to different, at farmers markets. So they just want to sell one big crop or several different crops all at once out to a distributor or restaurant and just be done with it. So that is an option, and how that would work best for your business. I put the word risk in here because when you think about the way that you grow produce, there is a chance for adverse weather events or things starting to ripen all at the same time. And if you don't have the opportunity to sell at a higher volume or all at once, you could be leaving some fruit past ripe in the or fruit or vegetables past ripe in the field, which could lower quality. So depending on if you planned for that ahead of time, by kind of staggering your planting, if you were selling more direct marketing, or you can plant it all at once and then be done with that cycle. I did want to know, and I believe Liz is going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but when you do sell wholesale, there tends to be a little bit of an increase in labor requirements, basically because is so much more product. And there's also a lot more in terms of post-harvest handling, washing, getting it ready for market that way. So, yep.
Yeah, I would say your labor could shift.
Yeah.
Because, with doing direct marketing, you may be spending more time doing customer interface with a variety of customers, or you may be doing a wider variety of
Correct.
different products. I mean, very few people direct market like just one thing. But so you may have lower labor requirements in some ways because you're able to streamline things, because you're now, instead of doing 500 different crops all requiring hand labor, and that you're like sitting at farmers markets with, you're doing like one crop or two crops that you do in more volume, and you're done. But yeah, you're right. But on the other hand, you may have other labor requirements as far as sorting, packing, food safety that you don't have.
Right, right, and there are several, documents available, some case studies,
Mhm.
on the differences between, labor requirements for, say, wholesale, doing the 1 or 2 crops, getting it through the packing house, the whole 9, versus doing that direct customer interaction type of marketing. It's actually a good read because you are right there. It might not be very different, or it might save you a little time doing it wholesale. It just depends. So that's something that when you're determining if you want to do wholesale, where records as far as time spent is really good to look at.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it may be a real business shift for your business.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Again, there's opportunity to sell larger quantities of a product, more at once than with, potentially direct marketing. One good thing is that you're able to concentrate more on the production than on marketing efforts, because a lot of times with direct, you you're often, consistently selling selling yourself, selling your farm, right? Alternately, once you gain that wholesale connection, it's kind of assumed over and over again that you are able to deliver on that product, and there's standards for that as well. So it all depends.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, yep, yep. So
Yeah, you
it
can't give up on I mean,
no,
doing
no.
wholesale doesn't mean you don't do marketing.
Right,
Um,
right, right, right. Marketing in this term is more of a general term than, yeah. I mean, you still got to do all the legwork to get to that point, but there is a bit of a shift as far as y- you know consistently
mhm.
being at a farmer's market or something like that versus the one time deal kind of thing. Um, you have the opportunity to arrange consistent orders and with buyers at a guaranteed sales. So
Mhm.
that's nice because you can be able to um, kind of rely on this model where you have potentially a steady income stream.
Mhm.
Whereas if you go elsewhere, you might not be guaranteed to sell all your product when you go to I'm going to use farmers market a lot. It's just the alternative that I think of most, and that most people do recognize. But yeah, when you go to the farmers market and you have a truck full of food, it's not guaranteed that you're going to sell it by the end of the day. But with wholesale, it's shipped off and you get your check, right? There is it, one thing that I do hear with farmers is, they have such a strong mission and they work really hard on kind of maintaining their farm's identity, their practices, and they do think that they kind of lose that identity when selling wholesale. But I would argue, I think it's just as strong when selling wholesale. I don't know about you, last time you've been to a supermarket or something like that, but when I go in and I see local produce that's for sale, it's very well labeled. I know exactly where it's coming from, what the farm is, where it is, any of their designations, organic, that sort of thing. I see that all over the place here. So, what your mission is, you can still make sure that people know about it as you go into wholesale as well. So it's not lost, I would say. And a lot of distributors or restaurants or places that you're selling wholesale, they do look for certain identification that kind of uh, might bring your product above everybody else's. So different designations, they do look for that as far as organic or naturally grown or things like that.
Well, and I think the other thing is that when you're selling, if you're selling wholesale and you have a certain set of buyers that you sell to, I mean, it's possible that your farm's identity may not make it down to like the actual individual consumer in the store, but certainly among the people that you're directly buying with, your farm's identity will, you will, if you have a good reputation, and your people will know about your farm.
Right. Absolutely. So this is a nice chart here. It just kind of gives you a visual on some of the different methods for selling, for marketing here. On the left, you'll see direct marketing. On the right, you'll see wholesale, and this is, it's general. So, don't don't take this chart to super heart, but generally, when you're selling direct, you kind of have a higher crop diversity, higher customer interaction. You're generally selling at a higher price. The volume is usually lower as far as the amount of product that you're selling. And post-harvest handling is usually lower as well, just because also the volume is low. Alternately, with wholesale, generally you have lower crop diversity, so you do one or two or three crops really really well at a higher volume. Customer interaction is generally lower because again you would set up these contracts with whoever you're selling to initially, and then from there it's just more or less a business transaction where you bring the product there and then you get paid. The price is generally lower when you're selling wholesale because you're selling it at more product versus direct with a higher price. And again, we touched on this before with the post harvest handling. It is a bit higher because there are certain standards, and as far as grading and sizing and cleanliness that need to be followed, that we'll get into a little bit later as well. But it is a bit higher with wholesale. Now,
Yeah, and actually, I like with the customer interaction.
yeah,
You may have fewer customers. Yeah.
right. Right. Yeah, it's not like you'll get away
Okay.
from never talking to anybody ever, but
You can talk
but
to somebody, but yeah.
some might,
But you
yeah.
won't have to talk to as many.
Exactly. Um, Now there is some multiple strategies involved with wholesale. We're not here to say that wholesale is the only way to go. A lot of farms kind of incorporate wholesale into their business, already established business, which is nice. So, if you're selling wholesale and you have extra produce that you can't sell through wholesale, alternately, you can also sell them through farm stands, farm markets, however you want to sell it there. Uh, if you have a CSA and you have extra produce at the end, you can sell wholesale, and vice versa. So it's an additional strategy that can help your bottom line on your farm to incorporate several of these strategies. So, but if you're really good at one or the other, then stick with that. But it's better to incorporate kind of both here.
Yeah, I've dealt with a lot of even bigger farms, bigger vegetable farms that do multiple sales channels. They may
Hmm.
do wholesale, but they also do have a farm stand, and some do have a CSA. And so they're not wholesale is not exclusive from, as Michelle said, these other channels.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a nice option, and and then you still get that customer interaction. You still get that marketing out in the community. They still know who you are, but it's just helpful to
Mhm.
potentially do both or several. Okay.
Yeah. So the one thing is when you're moving to wholesale, is that often you have this intermediary, who is buying your product, and they're buying product from lots of people. So yeah. So if you think about when you're ordering something online, right, and you can't see it, how do you know what you're going to get? How do you know like what it is? And you do things, you look at the description. Often you buy like brands or vendors you trust, right? And like trust is really important in wholesale relationships, because when you don't have, you can't see the product, you're ordering it off a sheet, or you're ordering it, having that trust means you're more likely to get, what you want. And that's, why we go when we're driving down the interstate. That's why we go to McDonald's, right? Because like we know what it's gonna be, even if we don't like it. Like it's at least you know what it is. The specifications. So you'll look at like, what are the, what is it? How is it the description? Are there legal requirements or trusted industry standards, that, tell me what this is, that I feel like I'm getting? Look at the warranty, right? If it isn't that, can I bring it back? So these are all things that carry over to thinking about wholesale. So that'll be the next slide. Next. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So when you're direct marketing, on the other hand, to consumers, you can show them the product so they can like actually, touch it or get a sense of what it is and then decide whether it's worth buying or not. Next slide, but don't click through all the way through yet. So like Michelle and I, we both have the cucumbers for sale, right? They're both cucumbers. So we call them cucumbers. We're selling them on the same date. They're the same variety, and you see over there, there's Michelle's cucumbers, and there's my cucumbers. The next click. Yeah, but like, if you look at mine and the next one also, if you look at mine, I've got, and the next one after that, sorry. I've got, cucumbers that are 4 inches and 6 inches. Whereas Michelle's are all like a beautiful 6 inches. They're all the same color. They're all pretty uniformly shaped. Mine are some light green ones, some dark green ones. So if we were to just say I have 4 cucumbers, like if you're a chef or you're a grocery store or you're ordering for someone, it'd be a lot easier to put a price on Michelle's cucumbers because there's a consistency there maybe than my cucumbers. Can you next slide? So are these the same product? That's really the question. So, and the answer is, no, not from a wholesale perspective. They're not the same product because Michelle's cucumbers they probably will sell for more than my cucumbers because you know exactly what you're going to get with Michelle's cucumbers. The whole case is basically, the same. Next slide. So that's why we talk about sorting, grading, and labeling. And these are all the things that we do to our products to help it, when we enter wholesale markets, be something that a buyer can understand. Sorting is sort of the first level. When you think of sorting, we do that in life, in general, right? Like we put, our own, we're doing laundry, we put the whites over here and the colors over there, right? That's sorting. Sorting is just sort of segregating or segmenting our product by whatever criteria we're setting up so that we group like with like, right? So that's sort of the large scale. At the very large scale, we do some level of sorting. So we might sort organic from non-organic. We might sort green apples from red apples. We might sort, and these are all, some types of sorting like organic, in that like organic standard produce from non-organic standard produce, may have federal regulations. Some sorting from like sweet apples to sour apples are just, like how we may define those things. They're relatively arbitrary. Grading is a type of sorting, and it's sorting that is separating produce or whatever kind of product into groups of similar grades, size, or other features that have some type of definition around it. So it's sort of like a level above sorting. And then labels are like what we use to describe what this is, however we've sorted or graded it. And so like if just for a moment, I want you to think about, and maybe in the text box, why do you think it's consistent grades and sorting categories and standardization of labels is important for wholesale markets? I'll just give you this is the limitation of Zoom.
Yeah, yeah. But it's a good question. It's I mean, it's one of the pillars of wholesale is grading, labeling, sorting, that sort of thing. So it's interesting to think about, you know.
Yeah. And really the consistency, right, is that how else do you assign a price to it? Right? Like if I just said I've got a house for sale, do you want to buy it? Like, well, like now sort it a little bit for me, Liz, right? Like
Mhm.
what neighborhood is it in? Let's sort by neighborhoods, right? Okay. How many bedrooms does it have? How big is it? Okay, now like once you start like giving these like thing terms we all understand, you can start to develop a market around things, and it leads to some level of market transparency. And so that like as a seller, you're conveying exactly what you're selling in a way that the buyer knows exactly what they're going to get. And that's why these consistency in sorting, around industry expectations for sorting, and grading, where there are standards for grading, and then labels that convey that stuff are so important, is because it allows us to move product and to price it and to receive prices in a way that you're comparing apples to apples, to sort certain types of food, right? So that's why this consistency is so important. um, and we do, I mean, honestly, we do sorting, labeling, and grading in retail, direct markets too. It's just in wholesale markets, it becomes even more expected. But you do these things. You don't just throw all your vegetables out on a table and say, price them yourself, right? Like you as a farmer already do a lot of this informally, and this is more thinking about doing it more formally. Next slide.
Yep. I just wanted to mention, we did have a chat in there, and it did, Joshua said a lot of wholesale buyers need to know exactly what they're getting so that they can properly represent the product to their customers. And he said, imagine ordering a case of unspecified cucumbers and getting a case of pickling cukes. Exactly.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. So you know what you're gonna get. You know what you're gonna get. And everybody knows what you're selling and you're gonna get. So we've already talked about the ways you can sort it, right? Like, I mean, we could sort all our produce by color if we wanted to, but like a lot of people don't want to buy a box of mixed yellow vegetables, right? Like, but but you could. I mean, so there's a lot of ways we can sort things. So next slide. So a lot of times, though, what we have, because like a box of mixed yellow vegetables, like we're going to sort them by color. I mean, actually, you do see grocery store displays where they kind of do that. It can be very attractive, but a lot of times we do it based on like sort of industry standards. And so, like this would be an example here. Like take apples, we have certain types of standardized packs, right? Like we have, you might have it packed on a tray as opposed to in a bag. So that would be one type of sorting. The variety, it's very common in some commodities, like we don't specify what the variety is. I mean, if you think about it, when you go to the grocery store and you buy blueberries, you very, very rarely see the variety of blueberry that you're buying, right? It just says blueberries. But with apples, the variety matters. Macintosh maybe not worth as much money as a Honeycrisp. So we divide by variety. Then we'll talk about grades more. You might sort by like the really stuff they call fancy versus stuff that would be used in processing. Item size, apples, you see there, it's like 80s, 88s, 100s. The lower the number, the bigger the apple. It's how many will fit into a tray. So hundreds would be small apples, and 80s would be bigger apples. So they sort by size, so that a buyer knows that, like a lot of times chefs or a food service, you think about food service, right? Like if you want to buy apples and you want to have one apple per kid, and you know that kids don't eat a lot of the apple, like they throw half of it away, are you going to buy a pack of 80s or are you going to buy a pack of hundreds if they're like they come in the same size box? Most food service people for an elementary school would rather buy hundreds because you're going to get the same size box, but it's going to be a whole bunch of little apples, right? Like, and that. Whereas if you bought a box of 80s, they're going to be bigger apples, and the kids, you'll have to have more boxes of them. So So even like size for some things can really matter. The next slide. Yeah, so so you really need to understand the categories that your buyers are looking for. You sort what you grow to meet the demands of your markets. And I'm actually working on a project right now with produce auctions and farmers that take their produce to Amish produce auctions for sale to try to figure out like what size and what shape and what type of sorting for tomatoes and other types of vegetables are really what will sell to the wholesale buyers that show up at these markets. So you really need to be very aware of if you're moving into a market, what do the buyers in that market expect? Next slide. Produce grading then is a very specific type of sorting and is more regulated. USDA Ag Marketing Service is the federal agency that administers federal quality grade standards for food and produce in the United States. But then a state can have additional standards. And then sometimes those state standards become sort of industry standards so that across the industry, it's well understood. So an example would be in Washington state. Washington is our biggest apple producing state in the US. They have what they call Washington fancy apples. So there's extra fancy apples already, and that's the highest federal standard. But then they have an even higher standard in Washington for what they call Washington fancy, and those are like those have a very specific description. And so even in New York, a buyer of New York apples may ask for Washington fancy, right? Because the industry even though it's not a federal standard, it's a state standard, the industry understands that standard and people can speak that language. The next slide. So grading for most commodities is voluntary. Like you do not need to grade your vegetables. Nobody is legally requiring you to grade your vegetables. You never have to like even be aware of federal grade standards at all, unless you're selling under a marketing order or a marketing agreement. Because in some cases, for some products, the industry maybe in that state or has set I think for onions they have a marketing order, so like you have to grade your onions and you can only sell onions of a certain quality, and that's to help maintain in the state a reputation for that product. But not most vegetables don't have marketing orders. I think apples might have them, and onions have them in New York. But that's really like because the growers in that state have decided that they want to like have the maintain a certain amount of quality coming out of that out of that state. Now, but like if you're selling like onions or apples informally at a farmer's market, you can sell whatever. It's only if you're selling them into wholesale markets, or if the buyer requires produce grading, right? Like, so if you're selling to certain buyers, they're going to want certain standard produce. But although grading is voluntary, the grade standards are regulated and they're very specific. So once you decide to call something a certain grade, once you take your apples and you stick a little sign on them that says Washington fancy, they better be Washington fancy, right? Because you are now applying something that has a legal definition to it. So if you make a grade claim about a product that has a regulated grade, and you need to make sure that product meets that standard, because otherwise, you could be sued from misrepresentation. And under federal law, if you've got a contract and you're to sell a certain grade, and then it gets there and it isn't that grade, the buyer has the right to refuse the product. So it is pretty serious. The next slide. Official grading of produce is available by USDA Ag Marketing Service for a fee. So you can hire Ag Marketing Service inspectors to come and grade your produce for you. Most people don't do that. That's not cheap. They can also train you on grading, like if you're really like ramping up to that level. But produce, fruits and vegetables and maple products can be graded by farmers. But so you can grade your own stuff. but you do have to meet the official grade standards. All grading for meat and eggs is done by official graders. So you don't have to grade anything. You don't have to grade meat. You don't have to grade eggs. You don't have to but as soon as you put a grade on it, make any claims about it, then it has to be done by the official grading person. Next slide. So federal grade standards are found at the USDA Ag Marketing Service website, and there's a catalog of grading supplies, and there's often supplemental information for help with grading. There's classes one can go to learn how to be a grader. There are people that do that for a living. So there is support for learning how to be a produce grader or how to grade your produce. And like you can buy, like, for example, you can buy like color things to to make sure your colors or your produce match and stuff like that if you're getting into that. But ag marketing service is where you would look for a lot of that. And then there's also like various produce industry support services too. Next slide. So let's look at like what does it mean to grade up some produce. So we'll use cucumbers as an example. I was actually glad to see the example on pickling cucumbers. So these are the official federal cucumber grades. There's extra fancy, extra #1, US #1, US #1 small, US #2, and cull. Cull means throw it away. And so this would be these 3 cucumbers here are an example of US fancy. Now, a fancy cucumber, I don't want to make it sound like a fancy cucumber is necessarily inherently better than a US #1. It's just that it meets certain standards so that people know what they're talking about when they're getting it. The next slide. So a fancy has to be well colored. They have to be like solid dark green all the way through. They have to be well formed. They've got that straight shape. And they can't be, and then all of the standards, right, can't be overgrown. If your cucumbers are old and seedy, they're not going to be, they're not going to meet grade standards. They have to be fresh, firm, free from decay, and that's true for all of the grade standards. And then fancy #1 can't have any sun scald. US #2, which often goes to processing, can have that. And then you'll see they'll have like little charts that show what well formed versus fairly well formed versus not badly deformed. Those all like actually do have thresholds. Next slide. So yeah, this would be an example of like what my cucumbers look like. Not
Me too.
overgrown. So yeah, once it looks like this, you're not meeting any sort of federal grade standard. Next one, that would be a cull. Well colored, these are like for federal standards, obviously, different varieties. There are like yellow cucumbers and there are little ball cucumbers and stuff. So these standards tend to be around the varieties that are often the most frequently sold in wholesale markets. So it'll be they're representative of a much more narrow segment of the industry. So these would be like well formed. They're straight. They're dark green. They're well colored. Then there's no yellow on them. Like these are just nice solid green cucumbers. Next. They're free from injury. Like you can see that they're you can't have the fancy has like less damage. The #1 doesn't have very much damage at all either. And then #2 has is less, it can have like dirt on it. And some but it says this US fancy #1 are free from damage, whereas #2 is free from serious damage. And then there'll be like a whole like paragraph in the federal regs around what do they mean by serious, right, as opposed to free from. So like all of these things are really defined. But these are generally what they look like. Next slide. So this would be an example of like yellowing, dirt or foreign material, scars, freezing. These are all things that would pretty much make your cucumbers not grayed out. Next slide. Oh, yeah, and next slide. Yeah, and the other thing with grades is they often, for some varieties will have size requirements. So a fancy has to be at least 6 inches long. Number one also has to be 6 inches long, and then a number two has to be at least five. Although they do have a number one small, I think probably for varieties that are smaller. So, but there's, they have to have a certain diameter. So I think the one thing that this really brings home, and I hear this from vegetable growers, is that, and you can think about this, is that if you are growing for wholesale markets, think how on top of harvest times you need to be, right? Like, because it's, you can see the things that would make your produce not grade out really fast, right? Like being oversized, being variably sized, having, being like, these are, so people who are growing for wholesale markets have to be pretty good growers, right? Because if you're going to get produce that's consistent, that's harvested in a timely fashion, that meets all these standards, this requires actually, a pretty high level of sort of control over your processes. The next slide. So often when you're selling to a wholesale buyer, they're gonna like specify what varieties of produce they want. Like this would be example of Cisco. They want Calabrese broccoli, not some other like heirloom broccoli. They want green asparagus, not white asparagus. They want Pascal celery. Like so they have very specific varieties, and then they have like certain grades that they will buy. So like if you want to sell to Cisco, here is as an example, you need this is what you would want to do because this is what they want to buy. Whereas if you're selling for like a CSA or a farmer's market or a farm stand or to different retail or wholesale markets, they might want different things. So the first thing would be to think about like who are your potential buyers and exactly what are they looking for. Next slide. So the things to remember is, buyers have an option to accept or deny a product based on the grade, quality at delivery, subject to PACA, which is the federal regulation around that. Make sure you know what your buyers want, and what kind of quality requirements they have and what their expectations are. Because if you're selling, if your contract is a certain USDA grade standard, that's your legal standard. And then, not all wholesale buyers want like are as picky, like, a lot of food hubs, some small distributors, it's really when you start like as you go up the volume chain or you go into certain markets, people get tighter and tighter and tighter. But it's not it's not like everything you have to grade every single product you grow and know this. It's just that some markets are going to this is what they're looking for, and you have to learn to speak that language and understand that for your produce. Next slide. So then labels, there like so these labels are what convey the information about your product. And then the question is who decides what goes on a label or what labels will go on a product. And that's a good question because as you can see, there's a lot of different potential labels one can slap on something, and there's only so much information that a consumer or a buyer can understand. And some labels are, highly regulated. Some labels are, really, something that maybe a group of growers comes up with. The next slide. But ultimately, labels are there really to help you communicate whatever it is that you need to communicate. So it could be the what it is you're selling, the quantity you're selling, the grade of the product, the quality of the product, the origin of the product. Is it New York grown? Is it locally grown? Certifications or standards, if they are. It could be kosher is a label, USDA inspected is a label, organic is a label. Traceability and ability to recall for food safety. So things like barcodes and, can help with that, or price lookup numbers that allow for easier tracking and point of sale at a retail market these are all labels that can go on food to help, sort of convey different pieces of information. Next slide. But if you learn nothing else from this presentation, the one takeaway I want you to have with labeling is that it's really, really, really complex. Food labeling is regulated by many different agencies. Different commodities have different labeling laws and regulations, both in content and format. Then states can have additional regulations on top of that. And if you make a false or inaccurate product or certification claim, that can result in legal issues. And so, it's so if you have something, and this can be even more complex as you get into like processed foods or, multi ingredient foods or things like that. But you know, you're you have to spend a lot of time really understanding what the requirements are of a label. The more complex a label you start to make, or the more claims you make on a label. Next slide. So regulation, I mean, I just want you to understand, like you look at this, for meat, poultry, eggs, labels are regulated by the Food Safety and Inspection Service, USDA, Federal Trade Commission, and that's around like sizing and stuff, and the state. Produce is regulated by the FDA for labels, Ag Marketing Service for labels, and those would be your grade quality standards, Federal Trade Commission for like truth in labeling, and weights and stuff, and the state. Nutrition health claims on food labels are regulated by the FDA. So if you have a bag of blueberries and you write blueberries are, will help you live longer, right? Blueberries reverse aging. Like if you put that on a label, you know, the FDA may say, well, where's you're making blueberries make you healthier. Like, depending on what your wording is or your language, if you're making a nutrition or a health claim, you could get into trouble with the FDA around that unless there's scientific, verification that that's actually true. Quality claims about produce, that's Ag Marketing Service in states regulate that. Various certifications can either be federal certifications like organic certification, state certifications like, grown in New York, New York grown and certified, or independent certifiers like, there's, I think, some like worker friendly certifications or humane animal treatment certifications. Those are independent certifiers. Product definitions. It's interesting. There's a whole guide around like defining like different products, but like there's a legal definition of like a chicken nugget versus a chicken finger versus a chicken strip, and each of these have like actually a definition. So if you've got a whole package of chicken fingers and you label them as chicken nuggets, you've now mislabeled them. So I mean, it's stupid. Like there's a broth and a soup are different. So there's like, and it's not always clear. Like ice cream and ice milk has a different like regulation, like standard. Like if you're gonna, all of these things actually, like you have to be careful about what you call something if it actually has a definition. And that would be the FDA or Ag Marketing Service, or the state may have a product definition. So it's really, 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 really complex, and it's really easy to, sort of make an error. Next slide.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and also the other thing is different end users have different labeling needs and expectations. So in the wholesale world, they don't want you to slap every, like, if you've got imagine a warehouse, right, full of produce boxes. Like you want to be able to find the information you need really fast. So, they're going to rank what they want to see on a box by the first, thing is things that legally or for certification have to be there. Those are sort of the not, non-negotiables. So, like there are, like what it is on the box, like, so if it's not or organic certified might go on the box. And then industry standards for what, like what people expect for the industry to be there. And then and then you want to make that key information that somebody's going to need on a produce box readily accessible. So like don't, and this is why on produce boxes, you don't find all of the information on the bottom of the box, right? Like, because you imagine going into a warehouse and everybody put all of the information on the bottom of the box. Well, now you're trying to like find, the case of orange, that's labeled oranges. Like you'd have to like lift up every box and look at the bottom, right? Like you want it to be, imagine where, like where the information will be in a cooler or whatever. Usually you find a lot of the information on the sides, right? Because that's often where, if boxes are stacked, you're not going to find it on the top. You're not going to find it on the bottom. You're going to want to find it on the sides, so like when you're looking at stuff in the pool house. So think about it, like location for a wholesale box or case. Consumer packaging though is really different, right? Like like number one is still the legal requirements for consumer packaging, but your goal is to sell your product, right? Like, so you may have other claims on your labels and stuff. And then the third thing then, so that's going to be number two for you. Like, like you're not trying to sell your product with a wholesale box, generally, but with a consumer package, you are. So you want something that's like the right color. You want to make a claim that'll be attractive to your consumers. So like, your consumers may care about worker, or animal, like humane animal treatment labeling on their packaging more than a wholesaler is going to care about it on a wholesale box that nobody's ever going to see because it'll be opened up at the warehouse. And then finally, industry standards, though, like for the packaging would be third. Like, so things like those price lookup codes or, or barcodes for traceability and stuff like that would need to be there to help it move through like a retail environment more expeditiously.
And that helps with also recall if
Mhm.
there should be any food safety issues down the road with packaging, you can be able to trace it back to a lot and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So that's increasingly really, really important. So the big tip in developing a label is that you always want to begin your label design with the mandatory labeling features that are required by regulations. If you deviate from those requirements to accommodate like your marketing or other objectives, you might not be in compliance. And then if you have that product out, it can all have to get recalled. And there would be nothing worse than like, sending out a whole like bunch of cases of something and then finding out that you have mislabeled it and having to not because there's anything wrong with the product, but because your stupid label's wrong. So you want to make sure that you've got the labels are as required by whatever regulations govern that label, and you want to ensure that the placement and prominence requirements for the features of the label are met. So a lot of times, people will design a beautiful label, they'll hire a designer, but they won't, that designer is not necessarily somebody who's really up on like the legal requirements. And so, you have to have that kind of laid out first. Next slide. The other thing is just reviewing, your information to make sure that no regulated terms are included, or if there any So if organic is a good one, right? Like if you call something organic, um, it needs to be organic. In the U.S., there are because that is a regulated term. So that would be one of those things that you want to make sure that you're not using a term that has a regulated definition improperly, because otherwise your food could all get recalled and you could get fined. And then make sure that foods that are subject to a standard of identity comply with that applicable requirement. And that would be, like that often is more an issue for processed foods than it is for produce. Next one. So there are like the state agents, New York State Ag and Markets will review your label for you if you need that. And then for federal, standard, like especially for meat and stuff, USDA will review your label for you. So have your label reviewed by the agency that regulates your product before you spend money printing up, because you don't want it to have to recall product because it's not labeled correctly. Next. New York actually has a labeling law, and every label in New York has to have 5 characteristics. The commodity by its common name, and the size has to be consistent with the most prominent printed matter. So this one actually is an example of where it's not quite right, because maple syrup, it's maple syrup, and the maple syrup is a lot smaller than all the other type. This would be, the name of the manufacturer has to be on it, the place of business, the ingredient declaration, in this case, it's 100% maple syrup, and then the net quantity of contents have to be on every like food label. Next slide. And then just actually flip through because I think this.
Yep. There was a question in the chat real quick, if we were able to give them the links to the labeling agencies, or the agencies that do
Yeah.
remove labels, if we can get that out.
Yeah, I have to dig it. Ag and Markets changed its website recently,
Yes,
so I
it
don't
did.
have
Yep, yep,
go back and find that again.
we
But
can get that out when we send out the recording.
yeah. Yeah, keep going.
Oh.
This would be, so you can see maple syrup here is much bigger. That would actually be more in compliance. For a wholesale box of produce or a bag label, you're going to want to have the commodity, potatoes, apples, or whatever.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. The size, count, or weight would go on it. So this is following, if you're following New York's 7 requirements, the grade, the packer, grower, shipper name and address, the packing date, the quality assurance code, so that for traceability, which Michelle will talk about, and then the country of origin. Next slide. And I think this is almost the end. So this would be an example of a label produce box. So you've got the address and the grower name. You can see that's on the bottom because often people don't need that right away when they're pulling stuff off shelves. The stuff that they have on the side of the box, which is the stuff that people will be looking for, is the peppers, the grade of the peppers so that you get the right case of it. The size of the package is on that size. And then the traceability information, because it's got certified, the picking date, the field, the crude, the farm ad, like all of that stuff that you need to make sure you're going to pull the right lot, is on the side. And then the other thing that's on the side, you can see is the brand, right? Top Crop. That's, something also that they have there. But key information that people will need to find quickly should be on the side. Stuff that people won't need quite as fast can go on the bottom or top. Next slide. And then I'll just pass, like meat and egg labels are even more complicated. So fortunately, this is not a meat presentation.
Next slide.
Next slide. Next slide. Let's be glad we're not doing it. So price lookup codes, most of you probably know this, but those little stickers that are on all your produce, there's assigned by the International Federation for Produce Standards. So you can look up, like for every single piece of produce, you can look up the number and it's just a set number. So any grocery store you go into, the same, like a banana is going to be the same code. So like if you're trying to check your own stuff out, if you memorized all those codes, you would never need to look them up. But I haven't done that. So you can, you basically, the only cost to you as a grower to put those little labels on your produce for retail grocery store markets and stuff is to print up the little stickers and stick them on, right? Because the codes are available. And you can look those up. And the next slide. Increasingly, you're going to need, for a lot of products, barcodes. And once again, those are something that you can also get. And on the bottom, there's the web link for where you can order barcodes for your company and then for the product lines that you sell. And so those allow you, once again, if you have those on your boxes or your cases, it allows for better traceability. So as you move into more complex markets, increasingly you're going to have to think about putting barcodes or using barcodes, I think, for your packaging.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So up next here, I just wanted to, since we are talking about, produce in general, I wanted to add a little bit in here about FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act. And apologies for the change in color here, but I pulled this information directly from the Produce Safety Alliance. So back in 2011, FSMA was passed and introduced into law. And out of that, there's 7 parts, but the one that applies here is the produce safety rule. And the whole idea is that it focuses on growing, harvesting, and post-harvest handling of produce. And the whole idea is to prevent people from becoming sick with food-borne illness or food illnesses. The focus is also on prevention and not detection of issues that come with it. So we'll get into this a little bit more here. But I want to mention that this course itself is about an 8-hour course that you'd go through. Again, we're just going to do like a brief overview, but there's plenty more to say about it. However, this is the first ever mandatory regulation for the production, harvest, and handling of fruits and vegetables. So if you're in any other farming business, say, meat, eggs, there's federal standards that are required already with those, getting your meat USDA slaughtered, etc. Up until that point, there wasn't any federal regulation or laws for produce until now. So we'll go through here. I just want to show that there were some produce safety rule compliance dates. If you fell into being required to be in compliance with FSMA, kind of the dates have come and gone, so we can work with you on getting your compliance up to speed on that. So FSMA broke it out into business size based on income. There are a couple exemptions that I can get into, but a very small business up to $25,000, and all other businesses over $500,000. So in 2020, even for the very small businesses, the compliance date has come and gone. So the FDA and the USDA, ag markets, they're all working towards regulatory process to make sure folks are in compliance. So it's good to get up to speed before they come a knocking, And of course, they push back the water compliance dates because that's such a complicated area. So we have a little bit more time to get water testing and things, up to speed on that. But again, we'll get into that. So like I said, there are some exclusions and exemptions for being in compliance with FSMA if you're a produce grower. So some things can be excluded, like if you only grow commodities that are what they call rarely consumed raw. So like potatoes, for example, is not included. So if you grow only potatoes, you wouldn't have to become in compliance with FSMA standards, because there's usually a kill step where the any potential foodborne illness can be, killed off here. Again, some growers can also be exempt based on the kill step. So if they do any kind of value added, pickling, certain things like that, you wouldn't have to become in compliance. Or if your average annual food sales and sales go to qualified end users, so direct to market versus selling wholesale. So if you sell wholesale, more often than not, you would have to become compliant. Regardless, even if you don't have to follow these standards based on whatever we just talked about here, it's best practice that all farmers should understand food safety risks on their farm and understand how to lessen that risk to your customer. So it's nobody wants to eat anything that has any bad stuff on it, right? So and I'm sure no one wants to grow that and sell that to somebody. So again, so growers may be exempt from the regulation based on those things we just talked about, but potentially where you are selling to might have the requirement that you be compliant. So grocery stores, some farmers markets might require you to do FSMA. It all depends, and it's all about risk management too. knowing that the produce that you're selling is free from any, potential contamination. So when you take this workshop for FSMA and understanding all the compliance areas, these are all the subparts of the produce safety rule, and each one has different requirements for you, but just wanted to go through a couple here. So overview of generally what FSMA is and how it applies to you. There's a certain personnel training for supervisors and workers. They discuss, health and hygiene on, the simple washing your hands, use of the toilets, cleanliness of clothes. Of course, agriculture water comes into a big part because that's generally where you'll find a risk of contamination with E. coli in the water. So there's certain standard on how much can be found, and generally it's 0, no presence. Anything with biological soil amendments of animal origin, which is a fancy way of saying compost. So making sure that you're composting properly to scientific standards, that it heats up to a certain degree for how many days. So there's standards on that. Of course, when we are out in the field, we see, we always see domestic, dogs, cats, and wild animals in our fields. So we want to make sure that either these are excluded from our field, or what we need to do to prevent any splash or runoff from any animal feces that may get onto your produce. So definite standards with that. Once you've grown them up and then harvest, there's certain post-harvest handling and packaging requirements, and how to best go about that to reduce risk of contamination. Of course, cleaning, sanitizing, equipment, preventing, mice and pests and bugs in your pack house, different things like that, and of course records. So it is pretty comprehensive, but to be honest, a lot of it is common sense. And you're probably doing the majority of it already. But there are the FDA has issued some standards that are there for food safety requirements. I spoke about the worker training requirement, but basically once a year you have to train your workers on how, if they're touching or handling produce, that they have to be, wash their hands, be able to perform their job duties correctly, and education on food safety. And that training would be documented as well. Any supervisor there has to have training as well. And they just have to complete a food safety workshop or webinar, however we're doing it right now. Most of them are online due to COVID, but one of the PSA curriculums that's available throughout the country and across the world, to be honest, that would be able to meet that requirement if you took that course. Again, the any workers that you have that are handling or touching produce, the training, it's pretty simple. It's just, the principles of food hygiene and food safety, what to do about visitors, hygiene for them, and documenting any type of injury or sickness. If you're touching produce, you definitely don't want to touch produce if you are sick. That's how, sickness can spread throughout. We always wash your vegetables no matter what. That's all. And how to communicate those food safety risks to supervisors if you should see something out in the field, like I had mentioned earlier about, animal droppings or, a sick employee, things like that. Key hygienic practices. I mean, and these are the standards basically for for FSMA, but that they are common sense. You know, you want to maintain your personal cleanliness. You want to avoid contact with animals and then touching produce. You know, make sure that you wash your hands thoroughly in between after you go to the bathroom. If you're using gloves, make sure that you're only touching what you need to be touching with those gloves and not anything else that may make that not sanitary anymore. A lot of times, if you go into wholesale packing houses or warehouses, there is a jewelry component about it where you need to remove any kind of jewelry or necklaces that can become that can harbor like dirt or anything that can't be cleaned or sanitized. So usually, you know, like men's wedding bands can be easily cleaned, but sometimes women's or, you know, jeweled ones have a very hard time. Of course, there's, you know, don't eat, chew gum, or use tobacco products in the area that you're using for your covered activity. So that means, you know, like in the warehouse or packing shed or wherever you're doing this, don't eat in there. Go to, you know, another room and eat there. And, you know, it's just all about food safety and trying to reduce risk of contamination. And we all know that when we chew, we, you know, some of us are not the best of chewers and spit can happen. So it's all about food safety. Of course, sanitation practices, good housekeeping. I mean, you know, keeping the restrooms clean, paper towels, toilet paper, eliminating pest and debris. Standing water is a big one in warehouses and packing houses because, you know, as you're walking around, you can splash contaminants onto fruit or produce. So you want to make sure that, you know, you don't have that or you minimize that area. Cleaning and sanitizing is super important. That's a whole big section in FSMA, and it's all about how you can remove physical dirt from the surfaces with the use of just clean water and detergent. That would be cleaning. And then you sanitize that surface after that, and that's a treatment of a cleaned surface that's going to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. Excuse me. And after teaching the produce safety course for a while now and taking the course myself, the one point they drive home is that um, you can't sanitize a dirty surface. So that's pretty big. So you know, you can't just spray disinfectant on a dirty table, you know, one that has dirt or you know, um, pieces of um, produce on it, right? You can't just do that. So you have to clean that off using dirt, some soap. I mean, using water and some soap. Then you can go ahead and use a sanitizer after that. All right. So now what? We're coming to an end. I know that was a lot of information here, but just wanted to make sure that all of you did have at least a little knowledge in a lot of areas of what wholesaling could mean for your business. So figure out if it works well for you, if that particular marketing channel will be a part of your business. Do your research, do your math, see how it all pan out. Make connections with wholesalers or different market chains, and then you can work on scaling up to meet those demands, right? All right, so this is the end here. Do we have any questions? So I do understand that was a lot, but we can open it up and you can unmute or chat box, however you like. And yes, we will certainly send out the recording. I'll send out the presentation as well, so you can, you know, look at it all
Can, this is Mike Sakenzia. This is a great program. I want to thank you for all this information. Can we just talk a little bit, maybe I missed it in all of this, but the PACA licensing requirements, can we go into that a little bit?
Packer, as far as
DACA, federal, the USDA requirement, if you sell more than 2,000 pounds on a wholesale level, you have to have that license. Seems to be, maybe there's some ambiguity around who needs that and what, but I don't know if it's part of within the purview of this discussion, but I think it's important if you're selling produce.
ooh, good one. I think you're muted, Liz. There you go.
Yeah, it's one of those, I have to admit, Michael, it's not one of those questions that I get asked a lot, because either the growers that I work with who sell at that volume of wholesale already know, and the ones who are below that, like, don't care yet, and they never asked me. So I know where the information is, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay, I appreciate it. All right.
But if you would like me to help, like, to follow up with you afterwards to talk more about it, I'd be happy to.
I would appreciate it, because we are new to this, and I know that PACA came up often in the farmers food box program under the original COVID relief that was passed. Many of the guys that were awarded the contracts, their contracts got challenged later on because they didn't have a PACA license. I'm looking at it more or less from future programs that are going to come on board in the near term, and whether or not that's going to be the stumbling block, and the cost involved in becoming PACA registered and things of that nature. So
yeah, because the purpose of PACA, and a lot of the bonding really is around is the responsibility of the buyer, more than the individual farmer. But it's to ensure, a lot of it is to ensure that farmers who sell product get paid. But also there is some, standards around. That's why there's the volume issues, because once you're starting to move into that level of volume, not getting paid, or if you're buying that much volume, you are more of a risk for people, right? So I would be happy to. I'll be happy to to follow up with you afterwards, and we can talk about it. Because I have to refresh myself. I'll be perfectly honest on the fine points of the law. The New York State has a similar law too. That's a little bit lower threshold.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And if anybody else is interested in it, I'd be happy. I mean, we could have another session on it. But it's definitely it's standards around buying and selling produce to ensure that buyers of produce get paid fairly for what they sell, and sellers of produce get paid. It's the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act is what PACA stands for. And it's really largely because if you're selling perishable produce, if it sits around, and doesn't get looked at or look, you can't, if somebody kind of is slow in paying you, or they're screwing things up, you can't just take your marbles home and sell them to somebody else, because they won't be good anymore. So it's the timeliness of fresh produce that makes PACA so important. Time sensitiveness of produce.
Yeah, that's interesting. A lot of our growers in our county, they don't produce enough yet to have that issue or the need for that kind of license. So thank you for bringing that up, Michael.
Yeah.
Well, I'm
sorry. I also brought that up for two reasons. Both, mainly, if you're a farmer selling to a distributor, you want to make sure that they have no PACA complaints, and that they are, PACA is the litmus test of whether or not you're going to get paid. Number one.
Yeah.
And then number two is, if you want to become more of a direct and go out and bid on some of these other contracts where you're bypassing that middleman and you don't have that license, other people who you compete against are going to use that against you. So PACA has been, in my opinion, very ambiguous often unheard of and difficult to get your arms around if you're a small guy. And I'm a small guy. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. Once you get above a certain, and there's also, like I just said, New York has a requirement for people who are buying and reselling produce over a certain volume too, that has a certain amount of bonding and stuff that they're required to have too. So if you're selling to if you're a smaller person selling to a produce buyer, or you're a reseller, you want to make sure that they have that license also, for the same reason, to ensure that you get paid.
What it comes down to, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And,
Yeah,
and
it's hard to repossess, a shipment of, tomatoes.
yes, right. And on the note of getting paid, I just did want to mention that when you are handing in your receipt or your the document that you're using to get paid with, I can't think of what it's called.
Invoice?
Invoice, yes, invoice, that's it. Thank you. When you're handing in your invoice to get paid, make sure it's got all the appropriate information on it, as far as it's legible, you have your mailing address on it, your terms of that you want to get paid on. Usually these are already hashed out ahead of time, but I just noticed, I've seen a lot of invoices where they don't even have a mailing address, so you can't get your check, and that holds up payment. So anytime I get a group of farmers, I want to make sure that your invoice is all up to speed so you can get paid on time. All right. If anybody else has any questions for you to share, or I put our email address into the chat box, so you can digest this and reach out afterwards. It's up to you, however you want to get a hold of us. And then a couple days from now, I'll get the recording out, and then you can have that for yourselves.
Yeah, and just so you all, I am a resource to fruit and vegetable farmers, especially in Eastern New York, as far as ag business questions. And so, some of them are hard to answer right off the fly. Things like PACA that are more complicated. But if you do have questions, I'm happy to either get you the answer or find who knows the answer for you. But not your dairy questions. I don't want to deal with those.
Yeah, no.
Michelle can handle those.
Oh, come on. No,
once I left Sullivan County, I was done with dairy.
Yeah, no problem. Well, thank you guys. Seeing no more questions, I want to thank Liz Higgins again for joining us. It was great, Liz. I that information you gave is like spot on, and it was really great. So I appreciate that. And I will say goodbye till next time. And again, shoot me any questions you have on the email there.
Yeah.
All right. Have a great Thursday, everyone.
Okay.